next to the door. In the gloom, they could see many rich-looking pieces of fabric and the shattered remnants of a table. What looked like a cot or low bed lay upside down in a corner. Several small chests could be seen, with their contents spread around the room, as if tossed about by some giant hand. Thomas tried to search through the mess, but nothing was recognizable as important or valuable. He found one small bowl of unusual design glazed with bright-coloured figures on the sides, and he put it inside his tunic. Pug stood quietly, for something in the cabin commanded his attention. A strange, urgent feeling had overtaken him as soon as he had stepped in. The wreck lurched, throwing Thomas off balance. He caught himself on a chest, dropping the sword. "The ship's lifting. We'd better go." Pug didn't answer. His attention focused on the strange sensations. Thomas grabbed his arm. "Come on. The ship will break up in a minute." Pug shook his hand off. "A moment. There is something." His voice trailed off. Abruptly, he crossed the disordered room and pulled open a drawer in a latched chest. It was empty. He yanked open another, then a third. In it was the object of his search. He drew out a rolled parchment with a black ribbon and black seal on it and thrust it into his shirt. "Come on," he shouted as he passed Thomas. They raced up the ladder and scrambled over the deck. The tide had raised the ship high enough for them to pull themselves up to the ledge with ease, and they turned to sit. The ship was now floating on the tide, rocking forward and back while the waves sent a wet spray into the boys' faces. They watched as the bow slid off the rocks, timbers breaking with a loud and deep tearing sound like a dying moan. The bow lifted high, and the boys were splashed by waves striking the cliffs below their ledge. Out to sea, the hulk floated, slowly leaning over to its port side until the outward surging tide came to a halt. Ponderously, it started back towards the rocks. Thomas grabbed at Pug's arm, signalling him to follow. They got up and made their way back to the beach. When they reached the place where the rock overhung the sand, they jumped down. A loud, grinding sound made them turn to see the hull driven onto the rocks. Timbers shattered and separated with a shriek. The hull heaved to starboard, and debris started sliding off the deck into the sea. Suddenly, Thomas reached over and caught Pug's arm. "Look!" He pointed at the wreck sliding backward on the tide. Pug couldn't make out what he was pointing at. "What is it?" "I thought for a moment there was only one body on deck." Pug looked at him. Thomas's face was set in an expression of worry. Abruptly, it changed to anger. "Damn!" "What?" "When I fell in the cabin, I dropped the sword. Phannom will have my ears!" A sound like an explosion of thunder marked the final destruction of the wreck as the tide smashed it against the cliff face. Now the shards of the once fine, if alien, ship would be swept out to sea, to drift back in along the coast for miles to the south over the next few days. A low groan ending in a sharp cry made the boys turn. Standing behind them was the missing man from the ship, the strange broadsword held loosely in his left hand and dragging in the sand. His right arm was held tightly against his side. Blood could be seen running from under his blue breastplate and from under his helmet. He took a staggering step forward. His face was ashen, and his eyes wide with pain and confusion. He shouted something incomprehensible at the boys. They stepped back slowly, raising their hands to show they were unarmed. He took another step towards them, and his knees sagged. He staggered erect and closed his eyes for a moment. He was short and stocky, with powerfully muscled arms and legs. Below the breastplate, he wore a short skirt of blue cloth. On his forearms were bracers, and on his legs greaves that looked like leather above thonged sandals. He put his hand to his face and shook his head. His eyes opened, and he regarded the boys again. Once more he spoke in his alien tongue. When the boy said nothing, he appeared to grow angry and yelled another series of strange words, from the tone seemingly questions. Pug gauged the distance necessary to run past the man who blocked the narrow strip of beach. He decided it wasn't worth the risk of finding out if the man was in a condition to use that wicked-looking sword. As if sensing the boy's thoughts, the soldier staggered a few feet to his right, cutting off any escape. He closed his eyes again, and what little colour there was in his face drained away. His gaze began to wander, and the sword slipped from limp fingers. Pug started to take a step toward him, for it was now obvious that he could do them no harm. As he neared the man, shouts sounded up the beach. Pug and Thomas saw Prince Arthur riding before a troop of horsemen. The wounded soldier turned his head painfully at the sound of approaching horses, and his eyes widened. A look of pure horror crossed his face, and he tried to flee. He took 3 staggering steps toward the water and fell forward into the sand. Pug stood near the door of the Duke's council chamber. Several feet away, a concerned group sat at Duke Borwick's round council table. Besides the Duke and his sons, Father Tully, Culgan, who had returned only an hour before, Swordmaster Fannon, and Horsemaster Algon sat in assembly. The tone was serious, for the arrival of the alien ship was viewed as potentially dangerous to the kingdom. Pug threw a quick glance at Thomas, standing on the opposite side of the door. Thomas had never been in the presence of nobility, other than serving in the dining hall, and being in the Duke's council chamber was making him nervous. Master Fannon spoke, and Pug returned his attention to the table.
"Reviewing what we know," said the old swordmaster, "it's obvious that these people are completely alien to us."
He picked up the bowl Thomas had taken from the ship.
"This bowl is fashioned in a way unknown to our Master Potter. At first he thought it was simply a fired and glazed clay, but upon closer inspection it proved otherwise. It is fashioned from some sort of hide, parchment-thin strips being wound around a mould, perhaps wood, then laminated with resins of some type. It is much stronger than anything we know."
To demonstrate, he struck the bowl hard against the table. Instead of shattering, as a clay bowl would have, it made a dull sound.
"Now, even more perplexing are these weapons and armour."
He pointed to the blue breastplate, helmet, sword, and dagger.
"They appear to be fashioned in a similar manner."
He lifted the dagger and let it drop. It made the same dull sound as the bowl.
"For all its lightness, it's nearly as strong as our best steel."
Borwick nodded.
"Tully, you've been around longer than any of us. Have you heard of any ship constructed like that?"
"No." Tully absently stroked his beardless chin. "Not from the Bitter Sea, the Kingdom Sea, or even the Great Kesh have I heard of such a ship. I might send word to the Temple of Ishab in Krondor. They have records that go further back than any others. Perhaps they have some knowledge of these people."
The Duke nodded.
"Please do. And also we must send word to the elves and dwarves. They've abided here longer than we by ages, and we would do well to seek their wisdom."
Tully indicated agreement.
"Queen Aglarana might have knowledge of these people if they are travellers from across the Endless Sea. Perhaps they have visited these shores before."
"Preposterous!" snorted Horsemaster Algon. "There are no nations across the Endless Sea. Otherwise it wouldn't be endless."
Culgan took on an indulgent expression.
"There are theories that other lands exist across the Endless Sea. It is only that we have no ships capable of making such a journey."
"Theories,"
was all Algon said. "Whoever these strangers are," said Arthur, "we had best make sure we can find out as much as possible about them." Algon and Liam gave him a questioning look, while Culgan and Tully looked on without expression. Boric and Fannon nodded as Arthur continued. From the boy's description, the ship was obviously a warship. The heavy prow with bowsprit is designed for ramming, and the high foredeck is a perfect place for bowmen, as the low middle deck is suitable for boarding other vessels when they have been grappled. I would imagine the rear deck was also high. If more of the hull had survived, I would guess we would have found rowers' benches as well.
"Oh, war galley?" asked Algon.
Fannon looked impatient.
Of course, you simpleton.
There was a friendly rivalry between the two masters, which at times degenerated to some unfriendly bickering.
Take a look at our guest's weapon.
He indicated the broadsword.
How would you like to ride at a determined man wielding that toy? He'd cut your horse right out from under you. That armour is light and efficiently constructed for all its gaudy colouring. I would guess that he was infantry. As powerfully built as he is, he probably could run half a day and still fight.
He stroked his moustache absently.
These people have some warriors among them.
Algon nodded slowly. Arthur sat back in his chair, making a tent of his hands, fingertips flexing. "What I can't understand," said the Duke's younger son, "is why he tried to run. We had no weapons drawn and were not charging. There was no reason for him to run." Boric looked at the old priest.
"Will we ever know?"
Tully looked concerned, his brow furrowed.
"He had a long piece of wood embedded in his right side, under the breastplate, as well as a bad blow to the head. That helmet saved his skull. He has a high fever and has lost a great deal of blood. He may not survive. I have to resort to a mind contact if he regains enough consciousness to establish it."
Pug knew of the mind contact. Tully had explained it to him before. It was a method only a few clerics could employ, and it was extremely dangerous for both the subject and the caster. The old priest must feel a strong need to gain information from the injured man to risk it. Boric turned his attention to Culgan.
What of the scroll the boys found?
Culgan waved a hand absently.
I have given a preliminary and brief inspection. It has magical properties without a doubt. That is why Pug felt some compulsion to inspect the cabin and that chest, I think. Anyone as sensitive to magic as he is would feel it.
He looked directly at the Duke.
I am, however, unwilling to break the seal until I have made a more involved study of it to better determine its purpose. Breaking enchanted seals can be dangerous if not handled properly. If the seal was tampered with, the scroll might destroy itself, or worse, those trying to break it. It wouldn't be the first such trap I've seen for a scroll of great power.
The Duke drummed his fingers on the table for a moment. "All right. We will adjourn this meeting. As soon as something new has been learned, either from the scroll or from the wounded man, we will reconvene." He turned to Tully. "See how the man is, and if he should wake, use your arts to glean whatever you can." He stood, and the others rose also. "Liam, send word to the Elf Queen and the dwarves at Stone Mountain and the Grey Towers of what has happened. Ask for their counsel." Pug opened the door. The Duke went through, and the others followed. Pug and Thomas were the last to leave, and as they walked down the hall, Thomas leaned over toward Pug. "We really started something." Pug shook his head. "We were simply the first to find the man. If not us, then someone else." Thomas looked relieved to be out of the chamber and the Duke's scrutiny. "Oh, if this turns out badly, I hope they remember that." Culgan went up the stairs to his tower room as Tully moved off toward his own quarters, where the wounded man was being tended by Tully's acolytes. The Duke and his sons turned through a door to their private quarters, leaving the boys alone in the hallway. Pug and Thomas cut through a storage room and into the kitchen. Megar stood supervising the kitchen workers, several of whom waved greetings to the boys. When he saw his son and fosterling, he smiled and said, "Well, what have you two gotten yourselves into now?" Megar was a loose-jointed man with sandy hair and an open countenance. He resembled Thomas, as a rough sketch resembled a finished drawing. He was a fair-looking man of middle years, but lacked the fine features that set Thomas apart. Grinning, Megar said, "Everyone is hushed up about that man in Tully's quarters, and messengers are dashing from here to there, one place to another. I haven't seen such a to-do since the Prince of Crondor visited 7 years ago." Thomas grabbed an apple from a platter and jumped up to sit on a table. Between bites, he recounted to his father what had taken place. Pug leaned on the counter while listening. Thomas told the story with a minimum of embellishment. When he was done, Megar shook his head. "Well, well. Aliens, is it? I hope they're not marauding pirates. We have had peaceful enough times lately. 10 years since the time the Brotherhood of the Dark Path," he gestured, spitting, "curse their murderous souls, stirred up that trouble with the goblins. Can't say as I welcome that sort of mess again, sending all those stores to the outlying villages, having to cook based on what will spoil first and what will last longest. I couldn't make a decent meal for a month." Pug smiled. Megar had the ability to take even the most difficult possibilities and break them down to basics, how much inconvenience they were likely to cause the scullery staff. Thomas jumped down from the counter. "I had best return to the soldiers' commons and wait for Master Fannin. I'll see you soon." He ran from the kitchen. Megar said, "Is it serious, Pug?" Pug shook his head. "I really can't say. I don't know. I know that Tully and Culgan are worried, and the Duke thinks enough of the problem to want to talk to the elves and dwarves. It could be." Megar looked out the door that Thomas had used. "It would be a bad time for war and killing." Pug could see the poorly hidden worry in Megar's face and could think of nothing to say to a father of a son who had just become a soldier. Pug pushed himself away from the counter. "I'd better be off as well, Megar." He waved goodbye to the others in the kitchen and walked out of the kitchen and into the courtyard. He had little temper for study, being alarmed by the serious tone of the meeting in the Duke's chambers. No one had come out and said as much, but it was obvious they were considering the possibility that the alien ship was the vanguard of an invasion fleet. Pug wandered around to the side of the keep and climbed the 3 steps to the princess's small flower garden. He sat on a stone bench, the hedges and rows of rose bushes masking most of the courtyard from sight. He could still see the top of the high walks with the guards patrolling the parapets. He wondered if it was his imagination, or were the guards looking especially watchful today. The sound of a delicate cough made him turn. Standing on the other side of the garden was Princess Carline with Squire Roland and 2 of her younger ladies-in-waiting. The girls hid their smiles, for Pug was still something of a celebrity in the keep. Carline shooed them off, saying, "I would like to speak with Squire Pug in private." Roland hesitated, then bowed stiffly. Pug was irritated by the dark look Roland gave him as he left with the young ladies. The 2 young ladies looked over their shoulder at Pug and Carline, giggling, which seemed only to add to Roland's irritation. Pug stood as Carline approached and made an awkward bow. She said in short tones, "Oh, sit down, I find that rubbish tiring and get all I need from Roland." Pug sat. The girl took her place next to him, and they were both silent for a moment. Finally she said, "I haven't seen you for more than a week. Have you been busy?" Pug felt uncomfortable, still confused by the girl and her mercurial moods. She had been only warm to him since the day 3 weeks ago when he had saved her from the trolls, stirring up a storm of gossip among the staff of the castle. She remained short-tempered with others, however, especially Squire Roland. "I have been busy with my studies." "Oh, pooh! You spend too much time in that awful tower." Pug didn't consider the tower room the least bit awful, except for being a bit draughty. It was his own, and he felt comfortable there. "We could go riding, Your Highness, if you would like." The girl smiled. "I would like that, but I'm afraid Lady Marna won't allow it." Pug was surprised. He thought that after the way he had protected the princess, even the girl's surrogate mother would allow that he was proper company. "Why not?" Carline sighed. "She says that when you were a commoner, you would keep your place. Now that you are a courtier, she suspects you of having aspirations." A slight smile played across her lips. "Aspirations?" Pug said, not understanding. Carline said shyly, "She thinks that you have ambitions to rise to higher station. She thinks you seek to influence me in certain ways." Pug stared at Carline. Abruptly, comprehension dawned on him, and he said, "Oh," then, "Oh, Your Highness." He stood up. "I never would do such a thing. I mean, I would never think to... I mean..." Carline abruptly stood and threw Pug an exasperated look. "Boys, you're all idiots." Lifting the hem of her long green gown, she stormed off. Pug sat down, more perplexed than before by the girl. It was almost as if... He let the thought trail away. The more it seemed possible that she could care for him, the more anxious the prospect made him. Carline was quite a bit more than the fairy-tale princess he had imagined a short time back. With the stamp of one little foot, she could raise a storm in a salt-cellar, one that could shake the keep. A girl of complex mind was the princess, with a contradictory nature tossed into the bargain. Further musing was interrupted by Thomas dashing by. Catching a glimpse of his friend, he leapt up the 3 steps and halted breathlessly before him. "The Duke wants us. The man from the ship has died." They hastily assembled in the Duke's council chamber, except Culkin, who had not answered when a messenger knocked at his door. It was supposed he was too deeply engrossed in the problem of the magic scroll. Father Tully looked pale and drawn. Pug was shocked by his appearance. Only a little more than an hour had passed, yet the old cleric looked as if he had spent several sleepless nights. His eyes were red-rimmed and deep-set in dark circles. His face was ashen, and a light sheen of perspiration showed across his brow. Boric poured the priest a goblet of wine from a decanter on a sideboard and handed it to him. Tully hesitated, for he was an abstemious man, then drank deeply. The others resumed their former positions around the table. Boric looked at Tully and said simply, "Well?"
The soldier from the beach regained consciousness for only a few minutes. A final rally before the end. During that time, I had the opportunity to enter into a mind contact with him. I stayed with him through his last feverish dreams, trying to learn as much about him as I could. I nearly didn't remove the contact in time.
Pug paled. During the mind contact, the priest's mind and the subject become as one. If Tully had not broken contact with the man when he died, the priest could have died or been rendered mad. For the 2 men shared feelings, fears, and sensations, as well as thought. He now understood Tully's exhausted state. The old priest had spent a great deal of energy maintaining the link with an uncooperative subject, and had been party to the dying man's pain and terror. Tully took another drink of wine, then continued.
If this man's dying dreams were not the product of fevered imaginings, then I fear his appearance heralds a grave situation.
Tully took another sip of wine and pushed the goblet aside.
The man's name was Chomich. He was a simple soldier of a nation, Honshoni, in something called the Empire of Tsuranwani.
Boric said,
"I have never heard of this nation, nor of that empire."
Tully nodded and said, "I would have been surprised if you had." That man's ship came from no sea of Midkemia. Pug and Thomas looked at each other, and Pug felt a chilling sensation, as apparently did Thomas, whose face had turned pale. Tully went on. "We can only speculate on how the feat was managed, but I'm certain that this ship comes from another world, removed from our own in time and space." Before questions could be asked, he said, "Let me explain. This man was sick with fever, and his mind wandered." Tully's face flickered with remembered pain. "He was part of an honor guard for someone he thought of only as Great One. There were conflicting images, and I can't be sure, but it seems that the journey they were on was considered strange, both for the presence of this Great One and for the nature of the mission. The only concrete thought I gained was that this Great One had no need to travel by ship. Beyond that, I have little but quick and disjointed impressions. There was a city he knew as Yankora, then a terrible storm, and a sudden blinding brilliance, which may have been lightning striking the ship, but I think not. There was a thought of his captain and comrades being washed overboard, and then a crash on the rocks." He paused for a moment. "I am not sure if those images are in order, but I think it likely that the crew was lost before the blinding light."
"Why?" asked Boric.
"I'm ahead of myself," said Tully. "First, I'd like to explain why I think this man is from another world. This Chomich grew to manhood in a land ruled by great armies. They are a warrior race whose ships control the seas. But what seas? Never, to my knowledge, has there been mention of contact with these people, and there are other visions that are even more convincing. Great cities, far larger than those in the heart of Kesh, the largest known to us. Armies on parade during high holiday, marching past a review stand. City garrisons larger than the King's Army of the West." Algon said,
"Still, there is nothing to say they are not from—"
He paused, as if the admission were difficult.
"Across the endless sea."
That prospect seemed to trouble him less than the notion of some place not of this world. Tully looked irritated at the interruption. "There is more, much more. I followed him through his dreams, many of his homeland. He remembers creatures unlike any I have heard of or seen, things with 6 legs that pull wagons like oxen, and other creatures, some that look like insects or reptiles but speak like men. His land was hot, and his memory of the sun was of one larger than ours and more green in colour. This man was not of our world." The last was said flatly, removing from all in the room any lingering doubts. Tully would never make a pronouncement like that unless he was certain. The room was silent, as each person reflected on what had been said. The boys watched and shared the feeling. It was as if no one were willing to speak, as if to do so would seal the priest's information forever in fact, while to stay silent might let it pass like a bad dream. Boric stood and paced over to the window. It looked out upon a blank rear wall of the castle, but he stared as if seeking something there, something that would provide an answer for the questions that spun in his mind. He turned quickly and said, "How did they get here, Tully?" The priest shrugged. "Perhaps Culgan can offer a theory as to the means. What I construct as being the most likely series of events is this. The ship foundered in the storm. The captain of the ship and most of its crew were lost. As a last resort, this Great One, whoever he is, invoked a spell to remove the ship from the storm, or change the weather, or
some other mighty feat. As a result, the ship was cast from its own world into this, appearing off the coast at Sailor's Grief. With the ship moving at great speed on its own world, it may have appeared here with the same movement, and with the westerly blowing strong, and little or no crew, the ship was driven straight onto the rocks. Or it simply may have appeared on the rocks, smashed at the instant it came into being here.
Fannin shook his head.
From another world? How can that be possible?
The old priest raised his hands in a gesture of mystification.
One can only speculate. The Ashapians have old scrolls in their temples. Some are reputed to be copies of older works, which in turn are copies of still older scrolls. They claim the originals date back in unbroken line to the time of the Chaos Wars. Among them is mention of other planes and other dimensions, and of concepts lost to us. One thing is clear, however. They speak of lands and peoples unknown, and suggest that once mankind travelled to other worlds, or to Midkemia from other worlds. These notions have been the centre of religious debate for centuries, and no one could say with certainty what truth there was in any of them.
He paused, then said,
Until now, if I had not seen what was in Chomich's mind, I would not have accepted such a theory to explain this day's occurrences. But now...
Boric crossed to his chair to stand behind it, his hands gripping each side of the high back.
It seems impossible.
That the ship and man were here is fact, father, said Liam. Arutha followed his brother's comment with another. And we must decide what the chances are that this feat may be duplicated. Boric said to Tully,
You were right when you said this may herald a grave situation. Should a great empire be turning its attention toward Criddy and the kingdom?
Tully shook his head.
Boric, have you so long been removed from my tutelage that you miss the point entirely?
He held up a bony hand as the Duke started to protest.
Forgive me, my lord. I am old and tired and forget my manners. But the truth is still the truth. A mighty nation they are, or rather an empire of nations, and if they have the means to reach us, it could prove dire. But most important is the possibility that this great one is a magician or priest of high art. For if he is not one alone, if there are more within this empire, and if they did indeed try to reach this world with magic, then grave times are truly in store for us.
When everyone at the table still appeared not to comprehend what he was alluding to, Tully continued, like a patient teacher lecturing a group of promising but occasionally slow students.
The ship's appearance may be the product of chance, and if so, is only a cause for curiosity. But if it was by design that it came here, then we may be in peril, for to move a ship to another world is an order of magic beyond my imagining. If these people, the Tsurani, as they call themselves, know we are here, and if they possess the means to reach us, then not only must we fear armies that rival Great Kesh at the height of its power, when its reach extended to even this remote corner of the world, we must also face magic far greater than any we have known.
Boric nodded, for the conclusion was obvious once pointed out.
We must have Culgan's counsel on this at once.
One thing, Arutha, said Tully.
The prince looked up from his chair, for he had been lost in thought.
I know why Chomich tried to run from you and your men. He thought you were creatures he knew in his own world, centaur-like creatures called Thun, feared by the Tsurani.
Why would he think that? Asked Liam, looking puzzled.
He had never seen a horse,
or any creature remotely like it. I expect these people have none." The Duke sat down again. Drumming his fingers on the table, he said,
"If what Father Tully says is true, then we must make some decisions, and quickly. If this is but an accident that has brought these people to our shores, then there may be little to fear. If, however, there is some design to their coming, then we should expect a serious threat. Here we are, the fewest in number of all the kingdom's garrisons, and it would be a hard thing should they come here in force."
The others murmured agreement, and the Duke said,
"We would do well to try to understand that what has been said here is still only speculation, though I am inclined to agree with Tully on most points. We should have Culgan's thoughts upon the matter of these people."
He turned to Pug.
"Lad, see if your master is free to join us."
Pug nodded and opened the door, then raced through the keep. He ran to the tower steps and took them 2 at a time. He raised his hand to knock and felt a strange sensation, as if he were near a lightning strike, causing the hair on his arms and scalp to stand up. A sudden sense of wrongness swept over him, and he pounded on the door. "Culgan! Culgan, are you all right?" he shouted, but no answer was forthcoming. He tried the door latch and found it locked. He placed his shoulder against the door and tried to force it, but it held fast. The feeling of strangeness had passed, but fear rose in him at Culgan's silence. He looked about for something to force the door, and, finding nothing, ran back down the stairs. He hurried into the long hall. Here guards in Criddy livery stood at their post. He shouted at the 2 nearest, "You 2 come with me! My master is in trouble!" Without hesitation, they followed the boy up the stairs, their boots pounding on the stone steps. When they reached the magician's door, Pug said, "Break it down!" They quickly put aside spear and shield and leaned their shoulders against the door. Once, twice, 3 times they heaved, and with a protesting groan, the timbers cracked around the lock plate. One last shove, and the door flew open. The guards stopped themselves from falling through the door and stepped back, amazement and confusion on their faces. Pug shouldered between them and looked into the room. On the floor lay Culgan, unconscious. His blue robes were dishevelled, and one arm was thrown across his face as if in protection. 2 feet from him, where his study table should have stood, hung a shimmering void. Pug stared at the place in the air. A large sphere of grey that was not quite grey shimmered with traces of a broken spectrum. He could not see through it, but there was nothing solid there. Coming out of the grey space was a pair of human arms reaching toward the magician. When they touched the material of his robe, they stopped and fingered the cloth. As if a decision had been made, they travelled over his body until they identified Culgan's arm. The hands took hold of him and tried to lift his arm into the void. Pug stood in horror, for whoever or whatever was on the other side of the void was trying to pull the stout magician up and through. Another pair of hands reached through and picked up the magician's arms next to where the first held him, and Culgan was being pulled toward the void. Pug turned and grabbed one of the spears from against the wall where the shocked guards had placed them. Before either of the men-at-arms could act, he levelled it at the grey spot and threw. The spear flew across the 10 feet that separated them from Culgan and disappeared into the void. A brief second after, the arms dropped Culgan and withdrew. Suddenly, the grey void blinked out of existence with a clap of air rushing in to fill it. Pug ran to Culgan's side and knelt by his master. The magician was breathing, but his face was white and beaded with sweat. His skin felt cold and clammy. Pug ran to Culgan's sleeping pallet and pulled off a blanket. As he was covering the magician, he shouted at the guards, "Get Father Tully!" Pug and Thomas sat up that night, unable to sleep. Tully had tended to the magician, giving a favourable prognosis. Culgan was in shock, but would recover in a day or 2. Duke Borwick had questioned Pug and the guards on what they had witnessed, and now the castle was in an uproar. All the guards had been turned out, and patrols to the outlying areas of the duchy had been doubled. The Duke still did not know what the connection between the appearance of the ship and the strange manifestation in the magician's quarters was, but he was taking no chances with the safety of his realm. All along the walls of the castle, torches burned, and guards had been sent to Long Point Lighthouse and the town below. Thomas sat next to Pug on a bench in Princess Carline's garden, one of the few quiet places in the castle. Thomas looked thoughtfully at Pug. "I expect that these Shirani people are coming." Pug ran a hand through his hair. "We don't know that." Thomas sounded tired. "I just have a feeling." Pug nodded. "We'll know tomorrow when Culgan can tell us what happened." Thomas looked out toward the wall. "I've never seen it so strange around here. Not even when the Dark Brotherhood and the goblins attacked back when we were little, remember?" Pug nodded, silent for a moment, then said, "We knew what we were facing then. The Dark Elves have been attacking castles on and off as far back as anyone can remember. And goblins, well, they're goblins." They sat in silence for a long time. Then the sounds of boots on the pavement announced someone coming. Swordmaster Fannon, in chainmail and tabard, halted before them.
"What? Up so late? You should both be abed."
The old fighter turned to survey the castle walls.
"There are many who find themselves unable to sleep this night."
He turned his attention back to the boys.
"Thomas, a soldier needs to learn the knack of taking sleep whenever he can find it, for there are many long days when there is none. And you, Squire Pug, should be asleep as well. Now, why don't you try to rest yourselves?"
The boys nodded, bade the swordmaster good night, and left. The grey-haired commander of the Duke's Guard watched them go and stood quietly in the little garden for a time, alone with his own disquieting thoughts. Pug was awakened by the sound of footsteps passing his door. He quickly pulled on trousers and tunic and hurried up the steps to Culgan's room. Passing the hastily replaced door, he found the Duke and Father Tully standing over Culgan's sleeping pallet. Pug heard his master's voice, sounding feeble as he complained about being kept abed.
"I tell you, I'm fine," Culgan insisted. "Just let me walk about a bit, and I'll be back to normal in no time."
Tully, still sounding weary, said,
"Back on your bed, you mean? You sustained a nasty jolt, Culgan. Whatever it was that knocked you unconscious packed no small wallop. You were lucky. It could have been much worse."
Culgan noticed Pug, who stood quietly at the door, not wishing to disturb anyone.
"Ah, Pug,"
he said, his voice regaining some of its usual volume.
Come in, come in. I understand I have you to thank for not taking an unexpected journey with unknown companions."
Pug smiled, for Culgan seemed his old jovial self in spite of his wan appearance. "I really did nothing, sir. I just felt that something was not right and acted."
"Acted quickly and well," said the Duke with a smile. "The boy is again responsible for the well-being of one of my household. At this rate, I may have to grant him the title Defender of the Ducal Household."
Pug smiled, pleased with the Duke's praise. Boric turned to the magician.
"Well, seeing as you're full of fire, I think we should have a talk about yesterday. Are you well enough?"
The question brought an irritated look from Culgan.
"Of course I'm well enough. That's what I've been trying to tell you for the last 10 minutes.
Culgan started to rise from the bed, but as dizziness overtook him, Tully put a restraining hand on his shoulder, guiding him back to the large pile of pillows he had been resting on.
"You can talk here quite well enough, thank you. Now stay in bed."
Culgan made no protest. He shortly felt better and said,
"Fine, but hand me my pipe, will you please?"
Pug fetched Culgan's pipe and pouch of tobacco, and as the magician tamped down the bowl, a long burning taper from the firepot. Culgan lit his pipe and, when it was burning to his satisfaction, lay back with a contented look on his face.
"Now," he said, "where do we begin?"
The Duke quickly filled him in on what Tully had revealed, with the priest adding a few details the Duke overlooked. When they were done, Culgan nodded.
Your assumption about the origin of these people is likely. I suspected the possibility when I saw the artifacts brought from the ship, and the events in this room yesterday bear me out.
He paused for a moment, organizing his thoughts.
The scroll was a personal letter from a magician of these people, the Tsurani, to his wife. But it was also more. The seal was magically endowed to force the reader to incant a spell contained at the end of the message. It is a remarkable spell, enabling anyone, whether or not they can normally read, to read the scroll.
The Duke said, "Well, this is a strange thing." Tully said, "It's astonishing."
The concepts involved are completely new to me, agreed Culgan. Anyway, I had neutralized that spell so I could read the letter without fear of magical traps, common to private messages written by magicians. The language was, of course, strange, and I employed a spell from another scroll to translate it. Even understanding the language through that spell, I don't fully understand everything discussed. A magician named Fanatha was traveling by ship to a city on his home world. Several days out to sea, they were struck by a severe storm. The ship lost its mast, and many of the crew were washed overboard. The magician took a brief time to pen the scroll, it was written in a hasty hand, and cast the spells upon it. It seems this man could have left the ship at any time and returned to his home or some other place of safety, but was enjoined from doing so by his concern for the ship and its cargo. I'm not clear on this point, but the tone of the letter suggested that risking his life for the others on the ship was somehow unusual. Another puzzling thing was a mention of his duty to someone he called the Warlord. I may be reaching for straws, but the tone leads me to think this was a matter of honor or a promise, not some personal duty. In any event, he penned the note, sealed it, and was then going to undertake to move the ship magically.
Tully shook his head in disbelief. Incredible.
And, as we understand magic, impossible,
Culgan added excitedly. Pug noticed that the magician's professional interest was not shared by the Duke, who looked openly troubled. The boy remembered Tully's comments on what magic of that magnitude meant if these people were to invade the kingdom. The magician continued.
These people possess powers about which we can only speculate. The magician was very clear on a number of points. His ability to compress so many ideas into so short a message shows an unusually organized mind. He took great pains to reassure his wife he would do everything in his power to return. He referred to opening a rift to the New World because, and I don't fully understand this, a bridge was already established, and some device he possessed lacked some capacity or another to move the ship on his own world. Now, from all indications, it was a most desperate gamble. He placed a second spell on the scroll, and this is what caught me in the end. I thought by neutralizing the first spell, I had countered the second also. But I was in error. The second spell was designed to activate as soon as someone had finished reading the scroll aloud. Another unheard-of piece of magical art. The spell caused another of these rifts to open, so the message could be transported to a place called the Assembly, and from there to his wife. I was nearly caught in the rift with the message.
Pug stepped forward. Without thinking, he blurted, "Then those hands might have been his friends trying to find him." Culgan looked at his apprentice and nodded.
A possibility. In any event, we can derive much from this episode. These Tsurani have the ability to control magic that we can only hint at in our speculation. We know a little about the occurrences of rifts and nothing of their nature.
The Duke looked surprised. "Please explain." Colgan drew deep on his pipe and then said,
"Magic, by its nature, is unstable. Occasionally a spell will become warped. Why, we don't know. To such a degree it tears at the very fabric of the world. For a brief time a rift occurs, and a passage is formed going somewhere. Little else is known about such occurrences, except that they involve tremendous releases of energy."
Tully said,
"There are theories, but no one understands why every so often a spell or magic device suddenly explodes in this fashion, and why this instability in reality is created. There have been several occurrences like this, but we have only second-hand observations to go on. Those who witnessed the creation of these rifts died or vanished."
Colgan picked up the narrative again.
"It's considered axiomatic that they were destroyed along with anything within several feet of the rift."
He looked thoughtful for a moment.
"By rights, I should have been killed when that rift appeared in my study."
The Duke interrupted.
"From your description, these rifts, as you called them, are dangerous."
Colgan nodded.
"Unpredictable as well. They are one of the most uncontrollable forces ever discovered. If these people know how to manufacture them and control them as well, to act as a gate between worlds, and can pass through them safely, then they have arts of the most powerful sort."
Tully said,
"We've suspected something of the nature of rifts before, but this is the first time we've had anything remotely like hard evidence."
Colgan said,
"Bah! Strange people and unknown objects have appeared suddenly from time to time over the years, Tully.
This would certainly explain where they come from."
Tully appeared unwilling to concede the point.
"Theory only, Colgan, not proof. The people have all been dead, and the devices... No one understands the 2 or 3 that were not burned and twisted beyond recognition."
Colgan smiled.
"Really? What about the man who appeared 20 years ago in Salador?"
To the Duke he said,
"This man spoke no language known, and was dressed in the strangest fashion."
Tully looked down his nose at Colgan.
"He was also hopelessly mad, and never could speak a word that could be understood. The temples invested much time on him."
Boric paled.
"Gods! A nation of warriors with armies many times the size of our own, who have access to our world at will. Let us hope they have not turned their eyes toward the kingdom."
Colgan nodded and blew a puff of smoke.
"As yet, we have not heard of any other appearances of these people, and we may not have to fear them. But I have a feeling."
He left the thought unfinished for a moment. He turned a little to one side, easing some minor discomfort, then said,
"It may be nothing, but a reference to a bridge in the message troubles me. It smacks of a permanent way between the worlds already in existence. I hope I'm wrong."
The sound of feet pounding up the stairs made them turn. A guard hurried in and came to attention before the Duke, handing him a small paper. The Duke dismissed the man and opened the folded paper. He read it quickly, then handed it to Tully.
"I sent fast riders to the elves and the dwarves with pigeons to carry replies.
The Elf Queen sends word that she is already riding to Criddy, and will be here in 2 days' time." Tully shook his head.
"As long as I have lived, I have never heard of the Lady Algarana leaving Elvendar. This sets my bones cold."
Colgan said,
"Things must be approaching a serious turn for her to come here. I hope I am wrong, but think that we are not the only ones to have news of these Chirani."
Silence descended over the room, and Pug was struck by a feeling of hopelessness. He shook it off, but its echoes followed him for days. Chapter 6. Elf Council. Pug leaned out the window. Despite the driving rain that had come in the early morning, the courtyard was in an uproar. Beside the necessary preparations for any important visit, there was the added novelty of these visitors being elves. Even the infrequent elf messenger from Queen Aglarana was the object of much curiosity when one appeared at the castle, for rarely did the elves venture south of the River Criddy. The elves lived apart from the society of men, and their ways were thought strange and magical. They had lived in these lands long before the coming of men to the west, and there was an unvoiced agreement that, in spite of any claims made by the kingdom, they were a free people. A cough caused Pug to turn and see Culgan sitting over a large tome. The magician indicated with a glance that the boy should return to his studies. Pug closed the window shutters and sat on his pallet. Culgan said,
"There will be ample time for you to gawk at elves, boy, in a few hours. Then there will be little time for studies. You must learn to make the best use of what time you have."
Fantus scrambled over to place his head in the boy's lap. Pug scratched absently behind an eye ridge as he picked up a book and started to read. Culgan had given Pug the task of formulating shared qualities of spells as described by different magicians, in the hope it would deepen his understanding of the nature of magic. Culgan was of the opinion that Pug's spells with the trolls had been the result of the tremendous stress of the moment. He hoped the study of other magicians' research might help the boy break through the barriers that held him back in his studies. The bookwork also proved fascinating to Pug, and his reading had improved greatly. Pug glanced at his master, who was reading while puffing great clouds of smoke from his long pipe. Culgan showed no signs of the weakness of the day before, and had insisted the boy use these hours to study rather than sit idly by waiting for the arrival of the elf queen and her court. A few minutes later, Pug's eyes began to sting from the pungent smoke, and he turned back to the window and pushed open the shutters. "Culgan."
"Yes, Pug?"
"It would be much nicer working with you if we could somehow keep the fire going for warmth, but move the smoke outside." Between the smoking firepot and the magician's pipe, the room was thick with blue-white haze. The magician laughed loudly.
"Right you are."
He closed his eyes for a moment. His hands flew in a furious motion, and he softly mouthed a series of incantations. Soon he was holding a large sphere of white and grey smoke, which he took to the window and tossed outside, leaving the room fresh and clear. Pug shook his head, laughing. "Thank you, Culgan, but I had a more mundane solution in mind. What do you think of making a chimney for the firepot?"
"Not possible, Pug,"
Culgan said, sitting down. He pointed to the wall.
"If one had been installed when the tower was built, fine. But to try to remove the stones from the tower, from here past my room and up to the roof, would be difficult, not to mention costly."
"I wasn't thinking of a chimney in the wall, Culgan. You know how the forge in the smithy has a stone hood taking the heat and smoke through the roof?" The magician nodded. "Well, if I could have a metal one fashioned by the smith, and a metal chimney coming from